I'm going to talk about centering Africa in Greek and Roman literature. As Paul said, this is based on both my teaching and my research since I joined the Department of Warwick in 2017. I teach a year-long module, so there is actually a lot of material from which I could have chosen, and I've tried to make it so, work in such a way that hopefully can be useful for different levels of teaching, thinking, and reading classics, not just a university. So I think my main question that I would like you to think with me a little bit is what happens if we kind of shift the focus on Greek and Roman literature, perhaps of some very canonical texts as well, although today perhaps I'm going to present about some less canonical texts, onto Africa. What happens if we shift that focus? What does that canon of literature, that body of literature says? Does it say things differently once we start seeing them from the viewpoint of Africa? And there is a big caveat to this, which is that what we talk about when we talk about Africa today is very different from what the ancients conceptualized as Africa. So what the Latins called Africa and what the Romans called Africa in Latin and the Greeks called Libya only maps onto some present-day nations of North Africa, which are Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya. So it does not include all the rest of Africa as the continent. It also doesn't include Egypt and what is modern day Sudan, which we can more or less map onto ancient Ethiopia, although ancient Ethiopia is very difficult to pinpoint on a map. It kind of goes as far perhaps as India in the east and as far as Niger in the west. So when I talk about Africa in my teaching, I actually talk about our modern conceptualization of Africa. So I do include Egypt and Ethiopia in the picture. And once we also include Egypt and Ethiopia, I think it's really interesting that we start finding that Africa is really pervasive in the Greek and Roman corpus. It's actually really hard to find a Roman author or an author writing in Latin who doesn't mention Africa in one way or another. And it is quite central to questions of identity, culture, and contact. And also, as I will talk about today, race in scared quotes across the Mediterranean. It is also very interesting. I think that Africa is quite peculiar. It is quite a unique case because of its extensive history of colonialism. It's quite unique in kind of giving us a sense of continuity between the way in which it was represented and partially othered in the ancient sources, and then represented, othered, and exploited in the early modern history and in colonial thought. So it gives us a very particular gateway into questions of sort of continuity around the representation of the other, but also, as I'm going to talk about, racialization or xenophobia or creation of stereotypes from antiquity into modernity. So the module that I have been teaching, which is, as I said, a year-long module, is about literature, and so it's not, a classical civilization or a history module. We really look at literary texts, and I called it Africa and the Making of Classical Literature because I'm especially interested in the question that I posed to you before, like what role Africa plays in the creation of a canonical body of, so a canon of Greek and Latin literature, and in the Greek and Latin literary texts. And so I'm interested in antiquity as much as in modernity. And I've divided the module into three big areas. I'm only going to touch a little bit upon the first one today. So the first one is representations of Africa and African people in the ancient texts. So the extent to which these representations can be seen to other Africa and African people, or to allow them to speak, to be properly represented. And whereas in term two, we looked at, on the one hand, analysis and discussion of selected Greek and Roman literary texts that are actually written by African authors, we think of Callimachus of Cyrene, for example, among the Hellenistic authors, but also Apuleius of Madauros, or the African fathers of the church, Tertullian and Augustine, but also authors writing in Africa, such as the Hellenistic authors, Theocritus or Apollonius of Rhodes, although we don't really know that he was from Rhodes. And so how do these authors who were writing in Africa, who were Africans, were negotiating their identity in antiquity among different locations and kind of also different cultures? And the end of the module actually looks at modernity, at what we call receptions of Greek and Roman antiquity. And it looks at some selected examples of African authors or authors of African descent who are kind of engaging with the Greek and Roman canon on literature and thinking about the assumptions that that are taken from the canon about the origin of literature in the West. And we looked, for instance, this year at the Nigerian playwright Wole Soyinka, who rewrites a version of the Bacchae as an African communion rite, or we looked at the novelist and essayist Toni Morrison, who engages a lot with especially with Greek tragedy in her novels. We read the novel Beloved, which in some ways is a rewriting of Medea, and in many ways it isn't. Or we looked at my only example from the Caribbean as a famous example is the poet Derek Walcott, who in Omeros thinks about how the ancient text, and especially Homer, as part of a colonial education, shaped his poetry, but also his kind of a number of identities of the Caribbean and of the people in the Caribbean in a hybrid that is somehow reminiscent of the hybridity of the ancient Mediterranean. But for this talk today, as I said, I'm just going to focus about some ancient representations of Africa or African people, and I'm going to talk about two themes in particular. One is race or racialization and how it is different from othering and stereotyping. And I'm going to think about two examples, which are the ancient Ethiopians, as we read them in Herodotus, and Carthaginians, as we read them in the playwright Poinolus. And then I'm going to look at, kind of related to this, how racialization and race interacts with other axes of oppression in a framework that we can call an intersectional framework. And I'm especially interested in these cases in gender and status, especially the difference between free and enslaved people. Some obvious examples for this would be Dido and Cleopatra, and I'm very interested to talk about them in the Q&A, like kind of canonical examples of how both their foreignness and their being women interact in their sort of oppression, in a sense, in the representations, in the sources. But I've already spoken plenty, I feel, about Dido in other events that I understand Paul has also recorded. So I thought that I would expand horizons, and I talk about a character that is very dear to me for some reason. It is a nurse, a Carthaginian nurse who appears in the Poinolus called Gidenis. And I also wanted to say something in the end as a coda to this lecture about the suppliant women of Aeschylus, which is another incredible case study, I think. So when we talk about race in antiquity and race in general, it's a very sensitive topic, and people do not agree on terminology a lot. What scholars generally agree on, however, is that race does not exist in reality, like in biological reality. It doesn't have a biological fundament. So the relationship between phenotypes and genes is just too complex it's not possible to divide people into races as the early modern period did, and with the invention of kind of pseudo-scientific racism. So while people agree that biological race is false, it doesn't exist, then sociologists actually disagree on whether we want to retain the concept or not. And I side with what are called racial constructivists in deciding to retain the concept of race as something that exists, because on a social and cultural level, because it informs a number of decisions and a number of injustices also as happening in the world. So it's a concept that exists in reality, even though it doesn't really have a biological or scientific foundation. And so I go with this definition by Geraldine Hang, which is that race is one of the primary names that we have that is attached to a repeating tendency of the gravest import to demarcate human beings through differences that are selectively essentialized as absolute and fundamental in order to distribute positions and power differentially to human groups. So this is very important about race. It's not just difference or otherness. There is a hierarchy and an oppression that goes with race and racialization. And because race is a process, it's not a thing, and in a sense, it's something that is imposed onto people by society. So unlike ethnicity, which is something that you may decide you side with, like something that is part of your identity, ethnic identity, race is kind of imposed. Then sociologists prefer to talk about race as a process or race as a verb. So they talk about racialization or racial formation rather than race, or they talk about racialized groups rather than races. And for antiquity, the big question, of course, is whether we can actually talk about race in antiquity, because technically antiquity predates the invention of what I call pseudoscientific racism in the early modern era that Geraldine Hang kind of predated a little bit to the 15th century, so the end of the Middle Ages in Spain, when we start seeing blackness kind of being attached to negative stereotypes in Christian thought, but it doesn't go as far as antiquity. And commonly the view is that, and this is the view kind of expressed at length by Frank Snowden Jr. in his two books, one in 1970, the other in 1983, these are Blacks in Antiquity and Before Color Prejudice, is the view that the ancients didn't attach race to skin color, that there was no prejudice attached to skin color, and in particular to dark skin color in antiquity. But this does not necessarily mean that the ancients were not able to think racially. And also we need to remember that when we talk about racialization is not just about skin color. People are racialized on the basis of a number of other traits as well. So the question is, did the ancients create differences among groups? Did they essentialize certain groups, and did they create hierarchies of oppression based on things that could have been skin color, but could have been other characteristics as well? And the view prevalently held, I think, especially by Benjamin Isaac and Denise Mccoskey, that you can see here on the slide, is that antiquity had a kind of what they call proto-racism, which did attribute certain characteristics to people that were felt to be unalterable, although these characteristics were sometimes attributed more to location and geography rather than to heredity. So that people who lived close to the sea, for instance, would be more prone to greed or to lasciviousness, as we're going to see in the case of Carthaginians. People who lived closer to the heat were stronger or more able to sustain things physically and therefore also morally. But the ancients really sometimes use location and heredity in ways that are sometimes confused. And so my first case study, as I said, we're looking at ancient African people in antiquity, is that of the Ethiopians. For the Ethiopians, clearly, it's not like the ancients were colorblind. The ancients recognized, the Greeks recognized that the Ethiopians were dark-skinned. Actually, Frank Snowden Jr. himself takes the Ethiopians as the epitome of what he calls Black people in antiquity. And the very name Ethiops comes from the Greek verb aitho, to burn, and ops, face. And as you can see, Pliny writes that they are dark-skinned because they live closer to the sun, whereas Ovid gave like a mythological explanation that Phaethon, the son of the sun, when he was driving the chariot of the sun and it went out of control, came too close to the African land, and so the Ethiopians became dark-skinned and Libya became a desert. But they didn't attach to any kind of moral or behavioral characteristic to the dark skin of the Ethiopians. And the first notions, the first mentions of the Ethiopians that we have in the Iliad actually talk about the Ethiopians as a blameless and pious and eternally happy people living at the edges of the world in a sort of fantasy land, continuously feasting and having the gods come to them to receive plenty of hecatombs. They are also referred to as extremely handsome, as is the case with the Ethiopian king Memnon. So while they are not attached to negative stereotypes, they are at any rate a little bit othered. This is what we can discuss. And they're sort of placed in some kind of strange utopia living at the edges of the world, that they're felt to be kind of very different people, very far away. And so they're not kind of given reality in a sense. When we get to Herodotus, the Ethiopians become, we can trace them to a little bit more historical characters. This is the case of an Ethiopian pharaoh that Herodotus refers to as Sabakos, who was king of Egypt for, pharaoh of Egypt for 50 years, was king of Ethiopia before, and who we can recognize in historical character, Shabaka of the 25th dynasty in Egypt. So he ruled Egypt for 50 years, and then Herodotus tells us he left on his own accord, and he describes him as an incredibly moral man and a great king, because thanks to him, the towns of Egypt flourished very much, because he wouldn't put to death Egyptian wrongdoers like they did before him, but he would decide according to their offense to ask them to raise embankments in the towns in which each was a native. And this is a way in which he left a very flourishing Egypt. And an even more important case study is what is referred to as the Ethiopian Logos in the third book of Herodotus's history, when Herodotus tells us the story of the long-lived Ethiopians, the story of the Persian king Cambyses, who had just conquered Egypt and installed himself as pharaoh, and who is considering conquering Ethiopia as well, as sending spies to Ethiopia to spy, and with the intent of conquering the land, as he knew that the Ethiopians had this amazing feast of meat called the Table of the Sun, so that he wanted to spy all else besides. And the Ethiopians are described very much like in Homer, again, as the tallest and fairest of all men. And then Herodotus tells us that it's kind of strange the way in which they choose kings, because they choose the king according to their height. So I definitely wouldn't be queen in Ethiopia. So the tallest and the strongest of men is chosen as king. So on the one hand, we can say, well, this is it's not a negative representation. But on the other hand, we can also wonder to what extent, when you think about kind of Greek democracy or Greek ideals, does this representation kind of other the Ethiopians? And when the spies sent by Cambyses come to the Ethiopians, the king of the Ethiopians kind of sees through this guile, and he tells them that the king of the Persians is not a righteous man, because if he was a righteous man, he wouldn't desire any country other than his own, and he wouldn't try to enslave men who have done him no wrong. So clearly, Herodotus is kind of putting in the mouth of the Ethiopian king a Greek view, kind of anti-Persian view that forms the backbone of his own histories, which are, after all, the story of the conflict between Greece and Persia. And this view kind of continues in the Ethiopian kings rejecting the gifts of the Persians. The Persians offer him a purple cloak, a twisted gold necklace and bracelets, incense and wine. He particularly appreciates the wine, but he rejects the other gifts, the purple cloak and the incense, because they are full of guile. He says the twisted gold necklace and the bracelets, he kind of makes a joke about the fact that the Persians enslave people, and he says, well, we have stronger chains than this. So he's kind of seeing through their guile, but he's also recognizing about the wine that kind of different people, every kind of people have something that they excel at. And so all of these gifts, except the wine perhaps, can be symbolically associated to sovereignty. So we can think that in rejecting them, the Ethiopian king is rejecting the sovereignty of the Persians altogether. He is also in a sense, kind of showing his own superiority and his humbleness with the, in the case of the wine, in which he recognizes cultural difference and marks of cultural differences and different superiority. So he is shown as an extremely moral and ethical character. On the one hand, though, he is also kind of exploited, as I said before, because Herodotus's focus is to other the Persians, in a sense. Herodotus's focus remains perhaps grounded on the Greek norm of freedom, which is not what the Persians which is the opposite of what the Persians come out like from this picture. And so to what extent can we talk about the Ethiopians here as being othered or racialized? So as I said, I don't think personally that there is as much to warrant the racialization of the Ethiopians in these sources, in the sense that I don't see the sources as kind of establishing a hierarchy that would justify, as I said, differential distributions of power among different people according to absolute and essential differences. But on the other hand, we can also say that the Ethiopians are othered. They're not given like a proper voice. They're made to speak whatever Herodotus wants to speak for his own narrative of putting the Greeks against the Persians and perhaps of racializing the Persians in that respect. But what I want you to think about is this difference. The racialization is not the same as cultural difference or ethnical difference, and it's not the same as stereotyping either. My second case study, which are the Carthaginians, is slightly different because the Carthaginians were actually conquered by the Romans. The Romans already after the First Punic War conquered territories of the Carthaginians, Sicily and Sardinia. Of course, the Carthaginians in turn were conquerors and colonizers, kind of proto-colonizers. And after the Third Punic War in 146 BC, Carthage was completely razed to the ground. The soil was doomed, and the place would stay a desert until Augustus managed to rebuild it, but he rebuilt it as a Roman colony called Concordia Julia Carthago, more or less at the same time as Virgil was writing the Aeneid. And we know that the Carthaginians had a vibrant culture, they had a vibrant theater, vibrant literature. All of this was completely lost. So there is a sense, I think it's a very different relationship of power that we can see between Romans and Carthaginians. And there is a sense that the differences about the Carthaginians are essentializing to the point that they would justify the Romans conquering of them. And Carthaginians have plenty of stereotypes attached to them. The most famous of them is untrustworthiness, which is called punica fides, so kind of Phoenician trust, and which is a byword for untrustworthiness in itself. So punica fides is attached to even to Romans, actually, to lots of people other than Carthaginians, but also to plenty of other African people, such as Mauritanians or Numidians. They also have greed because they are they live close to the sea, as I said before, and they are a merchant people, so they're greedy people. And traits of living close to the sea also make them idle, but also lascivious and effeminate. And these two stereotypes kind of go together for the Romans, which is a little bit strange, perhaps, for our for contemporary stereotypes, but effeminate Carthaginians would be sex addicts, kind of Carthaginian men would be sex addicts of women, for instance, extremely lascivious and sometimes incestuous as well, according to Roman stereotypes. And all of these stereotypes we can see in this play by Plautus called The Little Carthaginian, that was staged around a decade after the Hannibalic War, and whose title is actually uncertain. But if it is Poenulus, then some scholars have proposed that it's actually a mixture of two derogatory uses. One would be poenus, perhaps a derogatory term in comparison to the Latin Carthaginiensis, plus a diminutive poenus poenulus, which is doubly derogatory. So perhaps the title of the play, according to some scholars, and not everyone agrees, can be kind of itself already a slur in a sense. The play had one or more Greek originals. It is set in Calydon, so it's a kind of a Greek setting, but of course, for many scholars, it reflects upon interactions between Romans and Carthaginians. It's set on the day of a festival in honor of Aphrodite, and on this day, 2 Carthaginian girls are going to become official prostitutes. These Carthaginian girls were kidnapped from their house in Carthage together with their nurse, Gidenis, which we'll say a little bit more in a minute, when they were little, and they were sold to a pimp in Calydon. At the same time, their cousin, Agorastocles, was also kidnapped but given to a man, and he became a free man, a man who was kind of related by hospitality with his father. And Agorastocles, unbeknownst to him, is the cousin of the girl that he's in love with, Adelphasium, and he wants to marry her. At the same time, a Carthaginian man, the father of these 2 daughters, Hano, has been looking for them throughout the Mediterranean, and in the second half of the play, he comes onto the stage and he will declare them as noble and free Carthaginian women. That is more or less the story of the play. In the prologue of the play, we get a description of this Carthaginian man, which is very stereotypical. And all of the stereotypes that I talked to you before are kind of present here. So we're told that he looks for his daughters cleverly and smartly through the Mediterranean. And some scholars think that there is a sense, kind of a joke, that Hano perhaps doesn't care about the possibility of coming in incestuous relationships with his daughters, because he searches for them through all the brothels in the Mediterranean. And he first sleeps with prostitutes and then waits until the morning after before asking them questions and finding out whether they may or may not be his daughters. So this is why he says cleverly and smartly. We're also told that he's a polyglot. He knows all languages, but he's also kind of very untrustworthy, and he pretends not to know. And in Latin, bilinguis, which means both bilingual, it means both bilingual and untrustworthy, like kind of like a snake with a double tongue. And so we're told he's an out-and-out Carthaginian. What need is there for words? And when Hano appears onto the stage, he kind of exemplifies some of these traits. So he says that he sees Agorastocles, his nephew, although he doesn't know yet, he's his nephew, with his slave, and he pretends not to know Latin first and just wait and see what happens. And this becomes an incredible comic device in the play, because Agorastocles' slave, Milphio, pretends to know Punic, and he engages in a Punic exchange with Hano, but he kind of gets it all wrong. And so at the end, Hano has to say, oh, you know, you're good for nothing. I'll speak Latin from now on. And this allows Milphio to, you know, kind of have this outburst of rage and resort to slander of the kind that we have already seen. So he calls Hano a swindler and a trickster, a double-tongued creature with a forked tongue like a creeping beast. Elsewhere in the play is also defined as wily, subdolus. But at the same time, it's very interesting that Hano has also been defined the most pious character of Roman comedy, and in fact, the most pious character of Latin literature before Aeneas, which I think is particularly interesting. There's a lot of piety in the way he looks for his daughters throughout the Mediterranean. He continuously prays to the gods. He comes onto the scene with a Punic prayer to the gods of the city, and he prays to the gods continuously throughout the play. And so in a sense, we can think that this play really problematizes this very difficulty of reading racialization, perhaps in antiquity, and the difficulty of who are we, you know, laughing at? Are we laughing at Hano, or are we laughing at how the Romans laugh at Hano and how the Romans stereotyping him? And I think this is very clear in the exchange with Milphio. Do we laugh at Hano, or do we laugh at Milphio, who, you know, monolingual Milphio, who pretends to speak Punic, and he doesn't? So I think it's a really interesting piece of literature to talk about this kind of problematizations. And one last thing that I wanted to talk about in this lecture is the way in which, when we look at racialization, we need to look, I think, depending on the characters that we're looking at other axes of oppression, and how their different characterizations depend on other on other traits of their identity. And this is a framework, as I said, of intersectionality, which is a term coined by Kimberly Williams Crenshaw, that looks at the interconnected nature of different social categorizations, such as race, class, disability, gender, sexual orientation, as they create overlapping and interdependent systems of discrimination or disadvantage, both for individual and for certain groups. And I think this is interesting even in our ancient texts, as we look at how different characters have different characteristics applied to them, even phenotypes. So for instance, in the Poenulus, we're never told about the color of Hano's skin, but two of the women of the Carthaginian women of the play are actually referred to as dark-skinned. This is because probably the color of their skin and in general their appearance would be important for female characters who are kind of subject to male gaze and to a sexualizing gaze in a way that male characters aren't. Other characteristics change according as to whether they are attached to male or female characters. So bilingualism is a sophisticated skill for Hano, but for this Carthaginian nurse of the play, Gidenis, bilingualism becomes just womanly chattering. And it's very interesting that while we notice the piety of Hano's and also the emotional attachment that Plautus tries to create in the audience in his encounter with the daughters, there is another encounter between this nurse, Gidenis, and her lost son in the play. And this is completely kind of not erased, but it's sort of laughed about. So this is the encounter when Gidenis finds that her long lost boy comes with the retinue of Hano. He addresses her as Amma, so probably mother. She replies to him in Punic, and then Hano himself tells her to shut up and to spare us the female furniture. And Agorastocles asks him, what is that? And he said, it's the loud shouting, it's the loud shrilling of women. So we kind of get this sense of how different, I think, axis of oppression works differently for different characters. And very briefly, I just wanted to touch upon a last example that I really like to talk about in my module, which is the Suppliant Women of Aeschylus. That is an incredible play to talk about racialization, but also especially the feminine condition, and especially how intersectionality works for different characters in the play. This is actually a picture from Moni Obadiah's representation of the Suppliants in Syracuse in 2015. And the Suppliants was, and it continues to be, a play that really speaks about issues of immigration and contemporary issues of immigration. This in Sicily in 2015, in referring to the deaths throughout the Mediterranean of people coming from North Africa, and especially from Libya. And so that because the play talks about women looking for asylum and receiving asylum at Argos, it tells the story of the 50 daughters of Danaus who are destined and compelled by their father Danaus to marry their Egyptian cousins, and who escape to Argos to implore the Argive king Pelasgus to protect them and not to make them marry the cousins. Now we know that in the myth, the Danaids will end up marrying the cousins, and all except one will kill their cousins. So 49 of them will kill the cousins during the night, the first night of the wedding, and then they will be punished in the underworld for this. But this first play of the trilogy only talks about the Danaids asking and receiving asylum at Argos. It's an incredibly interesting play also to think about how the Danaids and the Egyptians complicate a strict polarity between Greeks and barbarians, or West versus East, because the Danaids and the Egyptians are both Greek and Egyptians. They are both Argive and Egyptians. You can see that they descend from Zeus and Io. Io was Argive, and then she was kind of sent by Hera to Egypt, where she became the goddess Isis. And a very interesting scene in the play is when Pelasgus tries to make sense of where the Danaids may come from, and he eventually decides that the Danaids are Greek because they have Greek attributes of the suppliants. So they are Greek because they have cultural attributes that make them Greek. The Danaids are black-skinned, but this plays no role whatsoever in Pelasgus's attempt to recognize them. Although he does say that they resemble women of Libya and then Amazons and Ethiopians, and he can't quite figure out when they come from, but then he finally decides, okay, they have cultural attributes of the Greeks, so he recognizes them as Greek. But if blackness doesn't play much of a role in the Danaids' representation, in this turn, instead, it plays a role in the representations of the Egyptians, and especially in their aggressiveness. And the Danaids imagine the Egyptians, they stress the blackness of the Egyptians, where they imagine their sexual aggressiveness. They talk about a black shape, a black army, a black spider, a black dream. And classicist Firoz Bazunia has analyzed this also with respect to which blackness and chthonic undertones, or the underworld, or the theme of death, kind of plays a role in this play. So it's interesting that blackness is used for male characters in this case, but not for female characters. And I just wanted to leave you with this quotation of Victoria Wool in thinking about the suppliant women as a play in which we're not really allowed to let the women speak. So the women are subject to all the male agents of the play. They're subjects to the Egyptians, to Pelasgus, to their father Danaus, and to the Argives from whom they seek protection, and they can only speak from the Argives. And at the same time, they are also subject to this fact of being foreigners. They're not being completely Greek. And Victoria Wool thinks that this is an incredibly play to think about in relation to things as they happen today, and how Western representation and also the Western state undertakes to kind of speak on behalf of women who are not Western. So when he tries to represent foreign women politically and representing them discursively, it slots them into a narrative that evacuates their political agency, replacing their indigenous voice with its own righteous action. So this is something that I want you to think with. So I'm sorry that I probably spoke a little bit more than I intended. I'm very happy to take questions, and thank you so much for listening. Yeah, I did receive some questions, so I'm happy to take some of them if you want them. I received a question to the extent to which we talk about kind of race today. Okay, sorry, I can see a question which is kind of related to another question I had. So to what extent Virgil's presentation of Carthage break the mold at all? And I did receive a couple of questions on Carthage, or one on Dido and to what extent she's meant to represent Cleopatra, and one on what Carthage would have looked like in Virgil's time. So I'm happy to talk about this. I did write a book on this. So I mean, the way in which I talk about Carthage, we do cover Carthage in the model quite a lot, Carthage in Virgil. And it's very interesting that when Aeneas arrives at the site of Carthage, he sees the city rising, which has a theater, and he even has a senate. And the line that says it has a senate have been interpreted as an interpolation in antiquity, like as a fake line, because he was like, what is Carthage doing? I mean, Carthage did have a senate. What is Dido's Carthage doing with the senate at all? And there is a sense that Aeneas, there is also clear symmetry with Aeneas arriving on the site of future Rome in Book 8 and his arrival at Carthage. There is a sense that Carthage plays the role of a sort of double Rome, but scholars have also wondered a lot to what extent we can read this Augustan colony that was actually being built as Virgil was writing in Carthage. And the way in which I interpreted this, I mean, one of the ways in which I interpreted this is that, I don't know how much you covered this in A levels, kind of world of the hero, but Aeneas and Dido actually never met. So there were like 370 years more or less of difference between their two stories. And Virgil was very much aware of this. He was aware that this was a fiction. So there is a sense, I think, in which Virgil is kind of commenting upon the whole fictionality of this story, where Dido is made to meet Aeneas in order to create an Aetion, a cause for the Punic Wars, and she becomes kind of a pawn into the hands of Roman representation, and the whole city becomes a city that is not yet there and was no longer there at the time of Virgil. So a complete fantasy of representation, and a city that is completely lost. And that is partly how I read Carthage. I don't know if this makes some sense. I'm happy to expand on that. Yeah, I see another question about interpretive possibility for the Danaids being both Greek and Egyptians, apart from viewing it in the context of pre-classical period Greek colonization. They feel themselves as Greek. So the sense, I think, in the play, I'm not, so the Greek side of things is a little bit out of my expertise, but my sense in the play is that they represent themselves as Greek. And what is something that I haven't really focused on, but when Pelasgus talks to them, he makes a mention of, he says, the Nile might nurture such a crop, and a similar stamp is struck upon the dyes of Cyprian womanhood by male artificers, which is a very strange reference, in which he's kind of referring to the fact that the ancient the ethnicity was the ethnicity of the father, so it's kind of the father line, and of Danaus being from Argos. So very interestingly, the Danaids in the play, it seems to me, are represented as Greek, as the sons of Danaus who decided to go to the Argolid, whereas the Egyptians are represented as Egyptians. And there is a sense, I think, of, well, I'm not sure if we can talk about racialization, but perhaps we can, in respect to the Egyptians. Because what counted was the role of the Egyptian's father, in a sense, which is very different, I think, from the way in which we think of race today. So as I said, it's not as much about heredity, but about place. So I think these are very different conceptualizations. Although they do make reference to the Nile a lot, they do make reference to some of their Egyptian heritage as well, but they would recognize themselves as Greek, and the whole play is about themselves wanting to be recognized as Argives. And so all their Egyptian traits, in a sense, are kind of downplayed, whereas the Egyptian or kind of othering traits of the Egyptians are stressed because they are the enemy. From the point of view of the Danaids, who are they also make the chorus of the play, so they are the protagonist of the play. I hope this makes some sense. What I wanted to think about. Yeah, sorry, did you want to expand?
No. Yeah, no. Thank you very much. Yeah, it does. It's interesting that they're also related to the Egyptians, and yet there is such a strong demarcation.
Yeah, I think what I was interested about is that, the role that these characters play in the play, and also their gender and their narrative role, makes a difference for their racialized characterization. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the same for Hano and Gidenes. And that's what I find really, really exciting, like really different, I guess, about, as an age that predates the invention of pseudoscientific racism.